Well, please turn your Bibles to 2 Timothy chapter 4. I do want to read verses 7 and 8. As you're turning there, I want to just say right up front how awkward it is for me to share my testimony. A lot of what I've experienced in my life, what God has done in my life, I've probably shared bits and pieces along the way in my almost 5 years here. I will say there has been very few occasions in my life where I have shared my life and things that I've gone through all at one time. So I might share a little bit here, a little bit there, and I can easily do that. But to share a lot of what occurred in my life can be very emotional for me sometimes. So I do apologize if I do get emotional, but when you talk about your life, at least I do, I get emotional sometimes, and so I would just ask you to bear with me. But the Apostle Paul wrote this in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. There is reserved for me in the future the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but to all those who have loved his appearing. I don't know if you've ever done this before, but I have. Have you ever compared scars with somebody else? Have you ever said, hey, where'd you get that scar from? And they tell you the story, and usually, if it's a young man, usually it's because they did something risky, and they got some scar somewhere, and I've got some scars, and the unique things about comparing scars is that when you share your story, you recall the event, you recall the pain, you recall the decision-making process for whatever it is that you did that led to you getting that scar. Sometimes it was just an accident, something occurred, sometimes it was a result of a bad decision that you made. But the unique thing is that when you hear other people's scars, they don't seem to hurt as much, and they don't seem to bother you as much because you don't know their pain that they experienced when they got that scar. So as you hear my story and as you hear Jeremy speak, and our scars are unique to us, and they are very sensitive to us, and as mine are. But there are several things that have occurred in my life. You could call them events. Some of these are tragedies that I call. Some are good things that I could have easily used as an excuse to not accept Jesus Christ, one. And secondly, I could have used those tragedies or those events in my life to abandon the faith altogether, to not even enter into the ministry. I've often wondered how my life would have turned out if certain events or certain tragedies hadn't even occurred, as I'm sure you have. But God has been good to me in spite of the things that I've faced, and He has used the good and bad experiences of my life to mold me into the man that I am today, into the pastor that I am today. The only reason I can get here and stand behind this pulpit and speak Sunday after Sunday is primarily because of the things that I've experienced, good and bad. They have made me into who I am. And the things that you've experienced, the bad things, the health crises, the loss of life, and all the things that you've experienced in your life have gotten you to where you are now. They have made you into the person that you are. Some of the things that I share, I will say this, because I'm being recorded, and I told Stephanie it's very awkward to be recorded because it's kind of like documented. This is like on YouTube forever, unless I take it down. But some of the things I share could be hurtful and painful to some people in my family, and I would never want to hurt them, but it's part of my story. So, but if I could pinpoint the exact things that have greatly affected my life, good and bad, I could narrow them down to 4 things. I could include a lot more, but I've narrowed it down just to 4 things. The first thing that I would say greatly affected my life was the divorce of my parents. My parents met at Red Branch Baptist Church, and they attended Aiken High School together. They were married in March of 1970. My brother was born over a year after that, in July of 1971. I was born 6 years later in December of 1977. Many of the memories that I have in my life are like snapshots. If you think back to your life, it's almost like a snapshot. You can see images, and I know when I think back to my early life, and there's a lot of things I can't remember, but I have snapshots, memories of things that occurred. And one of those things that I do remember, one of those snapshots in my life, is the day that my dad left in May of 1981. Even before my dad left, I was told, and again, I don't remember this, but I was told this, that my dad was gone quite a bit. He wasn't home very much, and we didn't really do much as a family. But I remember the day that he left, and I knew as a young man that my dad wasn't coming back, and that obviously affected me. And I remember grabbing onto his leg and begging him not to leave. Please don't go. My dad obviously did leave the home, left us, and my parents eventually did get divorced. And although I may not have fully understood it at the time, the divorce of my parents, the separation of my family in two different parts of Aiken County greatly affected me for the rest of my life. And I will say this to, and I think anyone here who is a child of a divorced home, no one understands the struggles of a child who comes from a divorced home, except the child who comes from a divorced home. And if you haven't experienced that, then you don't really know what I'm talking about. But I would struggle with the breakup of my family for the rest of my life, and it would weigh on my mind when I was a young person, especially as I share the next thing in just a moment. But it would always weigh on my mind. I didn't question anything. Did my dad leave because of me? It was never anything about that, but just the fact that my dad wasn't there, and I only saw my dad every other week, or there were times, and as I go on to share, my parents would obviously remarry. My mom would remarry my stepdad, who was Barry, and y'all have met Barry. He's been here before, and he has 3 sons from a previous marriage. My dad would remarry, and she had 3 sons and 1 daughter. And so coming to grips with having an extended family is not easy for a young person. You're kind of pulled in multiple directions, and it's very hard as a young person to, because many times you kind of have to, it's not that you intentionally, that you're showing your allegiance. So there are some times that my dad wanted me there for something, and I couldn't be there. There are times that my mom wanted me at a certain place, and I wanted to be somewhere else. And there's that constant pull in your life as a young person to be, and to others want you to be at certain places, and that can be very challenging. I know Christmas time has become, when I was young, was it was fun, because when you're young, you're getting Christmas gifts. It's fun. And when you're a divorced kid, you're getting, some people think you're getting double the gifts, but it really wasn't that fun, because there are times I wanted to spend Christmas with this parent, but it was this year I had to spend it with this one, and there was that constant pull of being somewhere that I didn't really want to be at that time for whatever reason, but I felt pulled in multiple directions, and no young person should feel that way, but I was. And so the divorce of my parents has always weighed heavily on my mind. I'm very grateful that my dad has changed a great deal. My dad's been here. He's obviously in poor health, and he hasn't been here in a while, but he's changed so much. I'm so proud of my dad. I'm so proud of my mom. So even though they are divorced, and all that's in the past, it's there. But it has made me partly in who I am today. But the second thing is the loss of my brother. I've already mentioned that he was 6 years old when I was born. My brother was excited about having a little brother. I shared with you all just recently that he loved the television show The Waltons. One of the last few clean television shows, but he named me Jason after his favorite character on the show, The Waltons. And so that's where I get my name from. In May of 1985, my dad picked us up after not seeing us. I was told, I don't know, I had this, when I wrote this years ago, I had my mom confirm this, but that my dad hadn't picked us up for almost 13 weeks. And so I'm sure Michael and I were very excited about seeing him just in general because it had been such a long period of time since we had seen him. But we were extra excited because he was taking us to the lake. He was taking me and my brother and my stepmom and my stepbrothers and my stepsister to Lake Murray. Myself and my brother and my dad were not the best of swimmers, so we would get in the water, but we wouldn't, ever really, do much more than just kind of paddle around and just kind of just get wet. But while my stepsister Lucy was swimming, my brother decided to jump into the water. Even though some young people may not remember this, but y'all remember the parachute pants that were very popular in the 80s? My brother was wearing parachute pants, and he wasn't a great swimmer. It was a spur-of-the-moment thing that he did. He just decided to jump into the water at my stepsister because they were fairly close in age, and they were really close friends. And when he jumped in, it was obviously a mistake, and he had trouble swimming from the very get-go. My stepsister Lucy did all she could to try to prevent him from sinking, and she always shares the horror that she experienced looking into his eyes as he went below the water. Several people, including my stepmom, tried to go in after him and try to pull him up, and they were unable to find him. Many people who were nearby heard what was happening. They would jump in. They tried to find him, but they were unable to find him. My brother died May 18th, 1985. I don't remember all the details of that day. I'm really glad that I don't. Things that I do remember, I wish, some ways I wish I didn't remember. But I remember my stepsister Lucy calling for help and several people jumping in. I'll never forget my dad wanting to go in and help, but he couldn't because he couldn't swim. I'll never forget seeing him go in multiple times, waist deep, wanting to go in, deciding I'm gonna go in, and he just couldn't. He couldn't do it because he wasn't a great swimmer. Several times, again, he would just go in. I just remember the heartbreak every time he would go in. He couldn't do it, and he would come back. And I remember that heartbreak. Of seeing that replayed over and over. And his face was very painful for me, very frightening for me. I remember when the paramedics got there, there was at that moment nothing they could do for my brother because they hadn't found him yet. But my dad wasn't such health-wise. He was just, they were very concerned about him. He was very upset. But I was so confused. I was so scared. It was a very traumatic event. I was told by my Uncle Ralph, actually not too long ago when I was at Darien, that when they got there, that I was just sitting on a bench all by myself with my head held low. And when my Aunt Wanda asked me if I was okay, she just said that I replied, I just want my mom. I just want my mama. I cried, and she held me until I fell asleep. And my Uncle Ralph had the terrible responsibility of calling my mom and telling her what had happened, because my mom, my stepdad, and my grandparents, I believe they were out shopping. They traveled somewhere for the day to do some shopping, and my Uncle Ralph had to speak to my grandmother on the phone to give her all the details because obviously he broke the news to my mom, and she obviously was upset, and he explained the details to my grandmother. And when my mom and my stepdad and my grandparents arrived to Lake Murray, I was told that my mom responded to and dealt with the loss of my brother Michael like you would expect any Christian woman to respond. She was in mourning. She wasn't angry. She never blamed my dad. I'm very grateful for that. She was just in mourning. I truly believe that she understood, and she has told me this many times, that it was an accident, that there was nothing that could be done. It's just something that occurred, and it was not my dad's fault. It wasn't anybody's fault. It just was an accident. My grandmother, on the other hand, who I love, and again, if there are people watching this, family members who watch this later, I mean no disrespect to my grandmother, but when my grandmother arrived, she was very angry, and she showed her anger. I guess the years since my parents had got divorced, she had built up a lot of anger and resentment towards my dad, and it just spilled out at that moment. But I have learned that tragedies in people's lives can either bring out the best in somebody or bring out the worst in somebody. And it happened that day. Seeing the good that came out of my mom and seeing the bad that came out of my grandmother. And again, rightly so, my grandmother had some anger that she had never had resolved. It just came out, the emotions. I've always said, when you are emotional, there's no telling what you will say or do in that moment, and it's very hard to control ourselves when we are emotional. But the death of my brother left a tremendous scar in my life that would affect me even till today. I was so scared when that all occurred in my life that I'm ashamed to say that I didn't even attend his funeral. I was too scared. I didn't know how to process it. There's been many occasions in my life where I wonder what my life would have been like if Michael were still here, if he were still alive. And I've even spoken to my parents about this, even just recently. We'll bring it up and we'll talk about it. But I don't know if I would be a preacher if he were still alive. I just don't know how that event shaped me into who I was, and if I would still be standing behind a pulpit each Sunday. But Michael's death left a serious sense of loneliness in my life. Being divorced, obviously I would go see my dad every other weekend. I was at home where my brother and I live, and when you're home by yourself and now that sibling is no longer there, you have a tremendous sense of loneliness. And I would go outside by myself and do whatever I could to entertain myself, to play around, just to be a boy. I was a young kid, so but I was alone, and people I always tell people I'm not a very outgoing person. I'm not a very talkative person. It's all rooted in that because I did so much by myself, and I could sit on the back pew somewhere and just be by myself, and I'd be okay because I learned to adapt to that since when I was young and lost my brother. But I didn't have anybody to defend me. I didn't have a brother to stick up for me. There were many times that I can think of, family members would call me by my brother's name. I knew it wasn't intentional, it was an accident. But in many ways, and it's hard for me to explain this and share this because even my parents may not know this, but I felt like in a very short period of time in my life, I had no identity. That when people saw me, they saw my brother, and I was no longer Jason Redd, but I was the memory of my brother, and that bothered me more angry than anything. It kind of bothered me. I was always very defensive of myself when someone would call me by his name, and again, I knew they didn't mean to do it, but I was losing touch of who I was and who I wanted people to notice me, and I didn't want them to forget my brother, and I didn't want them to forget what had happened, but I wanted them to see me, and that was hard. But I'm thankful at one point in my brother's life, he gave his heart to Jesus, and one day I'll see him again. But his death caused a ripple effect in my life. and in the lives of my parents. I remember the first time my dad picked me up after my brother had died. He took me to Wendy's. I was glad to see him. I was excited to see him, but at the same time, I was scared. I didn't know how to process everything that was happening. From that moment on, I remember where before my brother died, we didn't go to my dad's often. We would go to my dad's, but not very much. And it wasn't a routine type of thing. But after my brother died, I remember going to my dad's house on a regular basis. And I witnessed a lot of sad times in my mom's home, my dad's home. I remember my mom would come home from work and she would just cry. She'd go into her bedroom, shut the door, and I knew she was crying. My dad was very similar. There were times my dad would just cry when someone would mention even my brother's name. He would become emotional. And it's hard to see your parents experience that much pain and not really be able to do anything about it. You know, it was just something they had to go through. But the third thing, on a happier note, the third thing, and I hope we don't go over today, and I apologize if we do. But although my mom and my stepdad and I attended church before my brother's death, I remember going to church all the time afterwards. And I have a lot of memories of going to church. And we attended Red Branch Baptist Church, and we became very active there. I can still remember the first Bible verse that I ever quoted to Miss Peggy Johnson, a very sweet lady. I quoted the Bible verse Genesis 1:1. I'll never forget that. I was so proud of myself. Sometime in August of 1986, just well over a year after my brother had died, I remember walking down the road with a friend of mine that had just moved in across the road, and we were talking about going to church, and we were talking about what it meant to be saved, and I had gone to church enough to know what it meant why we went to church. I understood why we were going there. I knew who Jesus was, but I realized at that moment I had never personally asked Jesus to save me. I guess, without really understanding, I was trusting in going to church for salvation. I didn't even process. I wouldn't even put it in those terms. I went to church because that's what we did, and it made me happy. It was fun. But I realized, knowing what I knew about Christianity, what I knew about Jesus Christ, that I'd never asked Him to save me. And I knew that even if I were to die at that moment, that I would go to hell, because I had never said, Jesus, I'm going to trust in your shed blood for the forgiveness of my sins so that I can go to heaven. I had never done that. And so I did that day, and walking down the road, and actually on the same road that we live today. So where we live at today is very special to me. I had a little track. I just happened to have a little track that was given to me. I remember reading that little track and saying the sinner's prayer with a friend of mine walking beside me. I remember going home and telling my mom what I had done, and she was excited for me, obviously. The next Sunday, she dressed me up in a nice little suit that I had, and I remember sitting in church and knowing that when the preacher got done talking, the invitation song, and typically as a young man, you're like, okay, yeah, now we can go outside and play before we had to go home. But I remember thinking, I got to go up there. And so I was dressed, and I felt kind of like, what young boy dressed up in a suit anyways, but my mom dressed me up in a suit, and I knew I had to go down front. I remember being so nervous about going down front, and I remember my legs feeling like lead. Have y'all ever experienced that? Well, you feel like the Lord's really working on your heart, and you know you need to respond, but your legs just feel like they are literally lead, like you can't move. But I remember going down front and sharing my church family the decision I made. I was baptized sometime later in August of 1987 in an evening worship service. When I was home with my mom, I was involved in church faithfully. When I was at my dad's house, we didn't go to church much when I was young. When I started to drive, I would take me and my stepbrother to church. So in many ways, I kind of lived two different lives. So when I was at my mom's home, I would be the Christian young man that I knew I should be. I would go to church, I would go to church events, but when I would go to my dad's house, I would sometimes get in a little bit of trouble, and I won't elaborate on that, but I would do things I knew I shouldn't do. And I knew I was living two different lives. I knew I wasn't being consistent, and it bothered me. And so through the years of going to Reg Branch, I would see the Lord do some awesome things. I would see people come to know the Lord, get involved in church, become leaders in the church. I became a leader in our youth group when I was very young. I knew people looked to me for leadership. I knew that I needed to set the example, even in the midst of kind of living two different lifestyles, more or less. I knew that the young people in our youth group looked to me, and I knew that I couldn't share what I had just done at my dad's house by getting into trouble, whatever goofy things we had done. I knew I couldn't just go back and just share that with people at church because that would be embarrassing. So, but I learned I needed to straighten up. I needed to get serious, and I'd go to youth camps, and I would, and just over time, the Lord just really worked on me and allowed me to really straighten up and really make the two parts of my life more consistent, and I'm very grateful for that. I became a deacon at a very young age in September of 1998. I don't know what the math is on that, but I was very young. And so as a young deacon, I learned very quick, keep my mouth shut, and just kind of absorb it all in. I do remember being on the deacon board with my grandfather, which is very, very special to me. But some of the experience I had as a young deacon were joy, and some were very difficult. But it's very funny that a friend of mine that I used to work with is here today, because he actually filled some of this area of my life. Well, when I left Aiken High School, graduated from high school, I went to Aiken Tech, got a 2-year degree. Towards the very end of my time at Aiken Tech, I started working at a company called Parsons. And two people here today that I worked with then. Spent a great amount of time there. You've heard me say this, that I love the people that I worked with when I worked at Parsons. We had a great time. We pulled pranks on people. I'm sure Robert's thinking of some things right now, of things that we did. It was he and I that would do those things, the rubber snake in the cubicle and pull that across. And we would just do fun stuff, and we had a good time. I didn't enjoy the work as much because it wasn't as rewarding. I left there and went to Tool Engineers and loved working there. I loved the work that I did, and I worked there until August of 2007 when I became a high school teacher. But being at Parsons was a unique time for me because I got laid off there 3 times, and it was a very difficult time because I was newly married. Around that time, Stephanie and I had been married for about 3.5 years. This was, I can't remember which occasion this was, but one of the times I get laid off, it was during the week that my pastor at the time, Jamie Rogers, who came and spoke here a couple years ago, we were having no television week. He had this wild idea. We're going to encourage our church folks not to watch television for a week, and we want you to see how that's going to enrich your lives. Some of you would say, yes, that's a great thing. Well, that week of no television week was one week that I was laid off. And I was committed. I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And I'm not much of a reader. And so I was left to just reading. But you know, being laid off is a very difficult thing for a man. I shared this just recently. You felt totally defeated, and I did. I felt totally defeated. Stephanie was in cosmetology school, believe it or not. She had kind of left nursing temporarily, went to Lacey's Cosmetology, got her cosmetologist, whatever you call it, license. She was in school then, and I remember calling her and saying, hey, I need to meet up with you, need to tell you what's happened. And, but I remember going home and reading a book that was written by Chuck Swindoll, one of my favorite authors, a book called Moses, a Man of Selfless Dedication. And while reading that book, it was almost as if the Lord was speaking to me and told me, I want you to go into the ministry. And so I don't want to say I heard God's voice, but I felt God speak to me and say, I want you into the ministry. And I've been struggling with that for some time. I'll share in just a moment that I felt God's pull for a while, and it was just solidified during that time. And so I surrendered to the call to preach in March of 2003. So I'm approaching March 9th will be 20 years of ministry for me. I'm very thankful for that. But working at Tool Engineers in Augusta was a very lonely time because I enjoyed the work that I did there, but I wasn't as close with the people. And so I would go to work, and although I was friendly with people, but I wasn't close to those people. They lived in Augusta, I lived in Aiken. I was very alone, and not in the sense of loneliness, but alone in the sense that I would go at lunchtime, I would read a lot, I would study a lot, I would prepare. That was kind of my seminary. And during that time of my life, I really grew a lot spiritually. I thought I was already pretty solid in what I knew about God and in my faith, but I really grew a lot during that time, and that was my seminary. So the fourth thing I would just like to share would be when Stephanie entered into my life. And although I consider my salvation and God's work in my life very significant and a very important part of my life, my family is also very important. I want to read this right because I don't want to misquote this individual, this fictitious person. But in the movie Forrest Gump said this. Y'all read this? You know, it's funny what a young man recollects, because I don't remember being born. I don't recall what I got for my first Christmas, and I don't know when I got on when I went on my first outdoor picnic. But I do remember the first time I heard the sweetest voice in the wide world. Well, I know exactly what Forrest Gump felt like, because in middle school, in August of 1990, in 7th grade, I remember seeing this young girl in art class, and we had several classes together, and I remember thinking, gosh, if I could marry somebody like that. Because I knew then she was totally out of my league. And I was like, there's no chance in the world that she would ever be with a guy like me. Of course, I was young and stupid and didn't know how to process all that. But we became really good friends. She was out of my league. She's still out of my league. And I know that. I'm very grateful for that. And hopefully, men, you feel that way about your spouse. But she dated several guys before we started dating, but I just waited. I waited my turn. And I knew that once she started dating me that she would not go back, but actually it didn't happen that way. We dated for a little bit, and we still remained friends, but we did date for a while, and then we started dating again, and we never looked back. But we went on our first date in the fall of 1994. We were engaged in the spring of 1997. During high school, my senior in high school, I would actually leave campus and go to the place that she worked at, the jewelry store, Tidwell Jewelers, and I would pay on her engagement ring. I knew in high school I was going to marry her. I knew I was going to ask her to marry me. So I would go, and some weeks I'd go and pay $20. Sometimes I'd go $30, $50, whatever it was I had, I would go and put on that ring. But I remember that, and we were engaged in spring of 1997, and we were married in August of 99. But she's the first person to really tell me with great confidence that she saw me as being a preacher one day, but I still saw her. I thought that was crazy at the time, but she's been a huge encouragement to me. She's been a defender of me. She's the love of my life, and I'm grateful I have her in my life. I'm trying not to look at her for a reason, but she knows she's a great support to me. But just to wrap things up, there are some other things that have occurred in my life that have really shaped me into who I am. There are things that only Stephanie knows about. Some things I would say that are very traumatic, that I will probably never speak about openly, but they have shaped me. And many of you have things that have occurred in your life that you probably won't ever talk about, but you keep those private and you keep those locked up. But my faith in Jesus' shed blood for the forgiveness of my sins has made all the difference in my life. It has shaped me. It's allowed me to take certain events that have happened, certain tragedies, and put them in context and see how God can help me to overcome rather than allow those events to defeat me, allow me to just use it as an excuse, because I could have used any of those things to abandon the faith. You know, when Stephanie came to my life, I could have just said, hey, I'm going to put her number one, and I'm just going to totally just not worry about church anymore. But I didn't do that, thankfully. I could have used the loss of my brother, the divorce of my parents. I could have used any excuse I wanted to not be faithful to God. and to use any excuse to live how I wanted to. But I decided that I wasn't going to do that. I made a commitment to God to live for Him, and I trusted in Jesus for the forgiveness of my sins, and I knew I was saved, but I made a commitment I was going to be the kind of person that God wanted me to be. Amen. And I would tell you that as wonderful as that sounds, it takes commitment. It doesn't. God's not going to force you to be committed. This church used to be full of people, and the reason why they don't come is because they used to be committed, but they decided, for whatever reason, to not be committed anymore. And I don't mean that to bash them, but it's the reality. People make commitments and don't always meet those or keep those commitments. But I decided I was going to keep my commitments. And I'm going to keep my commitment as long as I possibly can. I'm not perfect. No matter how beautiful and handsome I look standing up here each and every Sunday, I'm not perfect. I do the best that I can, and that's all I know how to do.